Chapter 26. Thomas A. Harris. The following are quotes from his 1967 book, I'm Okay, You're Okay. The purpose of this book is not only the presentation of new data, but also to answer the question of why people do not live as good as they know how already. They may know that the experts have a lot to say about human behavior, but this knowledge does not seem to have had the slightest effect on their hangover, their splintering marriage, or their cranky children. Once we understand positions and games, freedom of response begins to emerge as a real possibility. In a nutshell, if we become more conscious of our ingrained reactions and behavior patterns, our life can begin to be genuinely free. Books in a similar vein. Eric Berne's Games People Play. Anna Freud's The Ego and the Mechanisms of Self-Defense. And Karen Horney's Our Inner Conflicts. You know that a book has become a classic when you see it featured in sitcoms. In an episode of Seinfeld, Jerry Seinfeld opens the door of his apartment to find all-time hopeless case George Costanza spread out on the couch reading, I'm Okay, You're Okay. For Jerry, reading a self-help book with a silly title is just one more piece of proof of his friend's loser status. I'm Okay, You're Okay was indeed an icon of the pop psychology boom of the 1960s and 1970s. Demand for the book was tremendous, and today it sits comfortably in the pantheon of titles that have sold over 10 million copies. But what do sales figures indicate? A lot of tacky books sold by the truckload in that era. What is different about I'm Okay, You're Okay is that it is still read and used. Your mental family. Parent, adult, child. To understand the success of Harris's book, we must look at the trail blazed by his mentor, Eric Berne, in Games People Play. Harris used Burns' work as a basis for his own, but instead of analyzing the games people play, he focused on Burns' concept of the three internal voices that speak to us all the time in the form of archetypal characters: the parent, the adult, and the child. All of us have parent, adult, or child data guiding our thoughts and decisions, and Harris believed that transactional analysis would free up the adult, the reasoning voice. The adult prevents us from being hijacked by unthinking obedience, child, or by ingrained habit or prejudice, parent, leaving us a vestige of free will. The adult represents the objectivity that inspired Socrates' statement, "The unexamined life is not worth living." It is the reasoning, moral voice that lets us grow, checking child or parent data to see if it is appropriate for a given situation. We might feel like throwing a tantrum when a hotel desk mixes up our booking, but instead we choose to accept it for the moment, figuring it is better to stay calm if we want a positive solution. Harris includes many examples of conversations which display people caught up in child or parent patterns, showing how difficult it is to remove racism or any type of prejudice when one is having no awareness of the patterns under which one is operating. What it takes to be okay. What does the title phrase, I'm okay, you're okay, actually mean? Harris observed that children, by virtue of their inferior power in the adult world, learn that I'm not okay, whereas you, being an adult, are okay. Every child learns this, even if they have a happy childhood, and many adults only overturn this basic decision after their parents pass on, and then perpetuate it in reverse fashion with their own children. Yet the good news is that once we are aware that it was a decision, we can decide to replace it with a relaxed, self-liking mode of being. We do not drift into the I'm okay, you're okay position. We may experience it on occasion, but for it to become more or less ingrained, it has to be a conscious decision, not merely a feeling, based on faith in people in general. It is a little like the Christian concept of grace, that is, total acceptance of ourselves and of others. From this position we are also better able to see beyond another person's parent or child behavior, even if that behavior would normally cause offense. We reach a level where we don't expect every transaction to make us happy, knowing that I'm okay, you're okay, is true even when we don't see evidence of it. whether you name it the superego, the adult, or in New Age parlance, the higher self. A willingness to allow your grown-up internal voice to come to the fore is part of any human being's development. I'm okay, you're okay provides a key for letting us out of a mental prison that we may not even have known we inhabit. Often it is more satisfying, and certainly easier, to play games or be defensive or rest on prejudices, and in our society we can be considered a success while essentially remaining in child mode all our life. In doing so, we consider other people as objects who will either help or stand in the way of our aims. Genuinely successful people, in contrast, assume that others are equals from whom they can learn valuable things. Final comments. Though Burns' work on transactional analysis may be the better book, Harris's I'm okay, you're okay became a huge bestseller, and a major reason has to be his use of the easy-to-understand parent, adult, and child framework. The terms may seem a little goofy, but in fact parallel Freud's original trinity of superego, ego, and id, the basic elements that Freud put forward for understanding human behavior. Although this is a work of popular psychology, Harris did not try to dumb it down to appeal to everyone. He freely quotes from the likes of Emerson, Whitman, Plato, and Freud, assuming that if readers don't know about such figures, they certainly should. Though it will never be a household term, transactional analysis does have real value in making us aware of our negative and normally unconscious behavior patterns. Given its do-it-yourself nature, the mainstream psychiatric profession never made much room for its way of seeing, but it has nevertheless become a part of the tool bag of psychologists and counselors who need workable techniques to bring about change. Transactional analysis has even found its way into fiction. James Redfield acknowledged Harris and Byrne as crucial influences in writing one of the biggest-selling books of the 1990s, The Celestine Prophecy. The control dramas that his characters engage in and seek to be free of are squarely based on the games and positions of transactional analysis. The survival of the book's characters, and indeed the evolution of the human race, is made dependent on their ability to see beyond these automatic reactions. Thomas A. Harris. Harris was born in Texas. He went to medical school at Temple University in Philadelphia, and in 1942 he began his psychiatric training in Washington, D.C., at St. Elizabeth Hospital. He was a U.S. Navy psychiatrist for several years, and was at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked. He became chief of the Navy's psychiatric branch. After the war, Harris held a teaching post at the University of Arkansas, and for a period was a senior mental health bureaucrat. He entered private practice as a psychiatrist in Sacramento, California in 1956, and was a director of the International Transactional Analysis Association. Chapter 27. Eric Hoffer. The following are quotes from his 1951 book, The True Believer. The rising mass movement attracts and holds a following not by its doctrine and promises, but by the refuge it offers from the anxieties, barrenness, and meaninglessness of an individual existence. Mass movements are usually accused of doping their followers with hope of the future, while cheating them of the enjoyment of the present. Yet to the frustrated, the present is irredeemably spoiled. Comforts and pleasures cannot make it whole. No real content or comfort can ever arise in their minds, but from hope. In a nutshell, people allow themselves to be swept up in larger causes in order to be freed of responsibility for their lives, and to escape the banality or misery of the present. Books in a similar vein. Nathaniel Branden's The Psychology of Self-Esteem, and Viktor Frankl's The Will to Meaning. If you have ever known someone who joined a cult, became a religious convert, or threw themselves into a political movement, and in the process seemed to lose their identity, this book may give you an insight into how that can happen. The work of an amateur, Hoffer's day job was loading and unloading cargo at San Francisco's docks. The True Believer, Thoughts on the Nature of Mass Movements, is a compelling foray into mass movements and their power to shape minds, showing us how spiritual hunger leads people to jettison their old selves in order to become part of something apparently greater and more glorious. The book had special meaning when published in the wake of the Second World War, given the havoc that a single movement, Nazism, wreaked across Europe. But Hofer's work is timeless in its observations of the psychology of group identification and why people are so ready and willing to die for a cause. Virtually everything he wrote could be applied to the terrorists and suicide bombers of today. Although a half-century old, the true believer could therefore not be more relevant. The wish for transformation. Why are mass movements so powerful? Because they are full of fervor, Hofer suggested. Powerful political movements always have a religious fervor to them. The French Revolution was really a new religion, replacing all the dogma and rituals of the Church with similar ones devoted to the state. The same goes for the Bolshevik and Nazi revolutions. The hammer and sickle and the swastika, Hofer observed, are in a class with the cross. Those who make up the ranks of the early stages of a revolutionary movement are looking for some big and total change in their life. Leaders of mass movements know this, and therefore do all they can to kindle and fan an extravagant hope. They do not promise gradual, incremental change, but a total change in the believer's existence. People normally join an organization for reasons of self-interest, to advance or benefit themselves in some way. Those who join a revolutionary mass movement, in contrast, do so to be rid of an unwanted self. If we are not happy with who we are, in a mass movement this no longer matters, as the self is irrelevant in relation to the larger, holy cause of the movement. Where before people experienced only frustration and meaninglessness in their individual existence, now they have pride, purpose, confidence, and hope. Faith in a holy cause is to a considerable extent a substitute for the lost faith in ourselves, Hofer wrote. Yet this desire to lose a sense of individuality, paradoxically, brings enormous self-esteem and feelings of worthiness. Other candidates. Who else is vulnerable to joining a mass movement? In his chapter on potential converts, Hofer noted that the very poor are not good candidates. They are too satisfied with just surviving to be interested in some grand vision. It is rather those who have a bit more, who have had their eyes opened to greater things, who are more likely to get swept up. Hofer observed, "Our frustration is greater when we have much and want more than when we have nothing and want some. We are less satisfied when we lack many things than when we seem to lack but one thing." People join mass movements for a sense of belonging and camaraderie, a feeling so often lacking in an economically free and competitive society. They may simply be very bored. Hitler, Hofer noted, was financed by the wives of some of Germany's great industrialists, whose regular amusements or enthusiasms no longer satisfied. The opportunity to get whipped up in a cause and its great leader is intoxicating, supplanting even reliable distractions such as family and work. Indeed, Hofer remarked on the curious fact that it is often people with unlimited opportunities who are attracted to mass movements. Finally, a movement will attract those who dislike having to be responsible for their lives. Young Nazis wished to free themselves from the burden of making decisions, and slowly constructing an adult existence as their parents had done. Much more alluring were the simple promises of glory in the Third Reich. They were shocked when, as losers of the war, they were expected to feel responsibility for what had happened, because in their minds it was precisely responsibility that they had given up amid the pageantry of the new regime. Why people die for a cause. A mass movement's promise of a dramatically better new world enables it to disregard normal moral inhibitions. The holy or glorious end justifies any means, and believers will do horrible things to other humans in the cause of creating their paradise. Hofer warned us to be very careful when hopes and dreams are loose in the streets. They usually precede some kind of disaster. To the non-believer, the self-sacrifice of a martyr, a kamikaze pilot, or a suicide bomber seems totally irrational. However, if our present life is considered worthless, and our belief in the movement is so great, it will not be such a leap to die for it. Before people reach this watershed, Hoffer said, they will have stripped themselves of a sense of their own individuality. Absorbed fully into the collective body, they are no longer the person friends and family once knew, but only the representative of a people, a party, a tribe. To the true believer, non-believers are weak, corrupt, without backbone, or decadent. The perception of their own purity of intent allows them to do anything in the name of that noble intention, including the taking of their own lives. It is this close-mindedness, blindness even, of the true believer that provides their power. If the world is black and white, then action is clear. It is only the open-minded who have to deal with surprises or contradictions. Final comments. One of Hoffer's insights was that what is not is always a more powerful motivating force than what is. While to improve their lot the average person will work on what they already have, the true believer is not satisfied unless they are in the process of building a whole new world. Such a hatred of the present has done terrible damage, but on the other hand, the overthrow of many kinds of tyrannies would not have been possible without those who dreamed and schemed for something better, who were willing to spark a bloody revolution in the cause of ideals, such as liberty and equality. For better or worse, fanatics have made our world. The true believer is not just about mass movements. It is a work of philosophy with keen insights into human nature and contains almost no unnecessary words or sentences. The book is also a great example of why questions of human motivation and action should never be left to psychologists alone. Eric Hoffer. Born in New York City in 1902, the son of an immigrant cabinetmaker, Hoffer grew up speaking German and English. At 7, he was blinded as the result of a head injury and missed out on most of his schooling. At 15, without any surgery, he miraculously regained his sight. Both his parents died while he was still in his teens. He inherited $300 and moved to California. Supporting himself as a traveling laborer and gold prospector, Hoffer spent his spare time reading everything from Montaigne to Hitler's Mein Kampf. For many years he worked as a longshoreman, or stevedore, in San Francisco, and only ceased manual laboring in 1941. The True Believer brought Hoffer a measure of fame, and he devoted the second half of his life to writing. Other books included The Passionate State of Mind and Other Aphorisms, 1954, The Ordeal of Change, 1963, The Temper of Our Time, 1967, Reflections on the Human Condition, 1973, and In Our Time, 1976. He also published a journal of life on the waterfront, and an autobiography, Truth Imagined, was released after his death. In the year he died, 1983, Hoffer was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Ronald Reagan. Chapter 28. Karen Horney. The following are quotes from her 1945 book, Our Inner Conflicts. Living with unresolved conflicts involves primarily a devastating waste of human energies, occasioned not only by the conflicts themselves, but all the devious attempts to remove them. Sometimes neurotic persons show a curious single-mindedness of purpose. Men may sacrifice everything, including their own dignity, to their ambition. Women may want nothing of life but love. Parents may devote their entire interest to their children. Some persons give the impression of wholeheartedness, but as we have shown, they are actually pursuing a mirage which appears to offer a solution of their conflicts. The apparent wholeheartedness is one of desperation, rather than of integration. In a nutshell, the neurotic tendencies we may have acquired in childhood are no longer necessary. If we leave them behind, we can fulfill our potential. Books in a similar vein. Alfred Adler's Understanding Human Nature. Anna Freud's The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. Melanie Klein's Envy and Gratitude. R.D. Laing's The Divided Self. Abraham Maslow's The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. And Carl Rogers' On Becoming a Person. Karen Danielson was in her mid-teens when Sigmund Freud wrote The Interpretation of Dreams. She would later be well known for feminizing the male bastion of psychoanalysis, but it took her 35 years before she even published her first book. In between, she married, had 3 children, and obtained a Ph.D. Karen Horney, as she became, broke away from Freud in some important ways. By refuting some of his ideas, such as penis envy, and generally downplaying the supremacy of sexual motivation, she arguably brought more sense to psychoanalysis. In addition, by showing how women are vulnerable to neuroses caused by unreal cultural expectations, she gained the diverse reputation of being the first feminist psychoanalyst. Horney differed from Freudian dogma by saying that people did not always have to be prisoners of their unconscious minds or pasts. She wanted to find the root cause of psychological issues, but largely considered them a present problem that could be healed. Her delineations of neurotic types, so simple and elegant, have been a significant influence on modern therapeutic practice, and her interpersonal approach and emphasis on uncovering the real self, with its great potential, were important influences on the humanistic psychology of Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. Finally, Horney wished to make the process of analysis sufficiently understandable that people could analyze themselves. In this, she presaged both cognitive therapy and the self-help movement. Our Inner Conflicts, A Constructive Theory of Neurosis, was conceived as a book for the layperson. While trained therapists should handle severe neuroses, Horney also believed that, with untiring effort, we can go ourselves a long way towards disentangling our own conflicts. It is therefore a self-help book, but a very fine one based on 40 years of keen observation of the mind's defenses. You will be a remarkable person indeed if you don't see at least part of yourself in Horney's descriptions of the 3 neurotic tendencies. Conflicts and inconsistencies. According to Horney, all neurotic symptoms, which are also called rackets, indicate an unresolved deeper conflict. Though the symptoms cause difficulties for the person in real life, it is the conflict that actually produces depression, anxiety, inertia, indecision, undue detachment, overdependence, and so on. A conflict involves inconsistencies, to which the person is generally blind. For example, someone who is greatly affronted by a perceived slur, when in fact none was given. One who apparently values another's friendship, but nevertheless steals from them. A woman who claims devotion to her children, yet somehow forgets their birthdays. A girl whose chief desire is to marry, but avoids contact with men. And a forgiving and tolerant person to others, who is nevertheless very severe on themselves. Things that don't add up like this indicate a divided personality. In relation to the mother, Horney commented that perhaps she was more devoted to her ideal of being a good mother than to the children themselves. Or perhaps she had an unconscious sadistic tendency to frustrate her children's enjoyment. The point is that an outward issue may often indicate a deeper conflict. Consider a marriage in which there are arguments over every little thing. Is it the subject of the arguments that is the real issue, or some underlying dynamic? How conflicts develop. Freud believed that our inner conflicts were a matter of instinctual drives coming up against the civilized conscience, a situation that we could never change. But Horney felt that our inner turmoil came about through conflicting notions about what we actually wanted. For instance, children growing up in a hostile family environment want love like everyone else, but feel forced to become aggressive in order to cope. When they become adults, these genuine needs conflict with the neurotic need to control situations and people. The person they feel neurotically driven to be, tragically, is the very personality that will never deliver them what they truly want. The behaviors they have taken on have effectively become their personality, but it is a divided personality. Rather than being about penis envy or the Oedipus complex, Horney felt that adult neuroses stemmed from more basic factors, such as too little love, smothering love, lack of guidance, attention, or respect for the children, conditional love, inconsistent rules, isolation from other children, a hostile atmosphere, domination, and so on. All of these make children feel that they have to make up for their insecurity in some way, developing strategies or neurotic trends that they carry into adulthood. Taken to extremes, neuroticism ends up creating Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde characteristics, divided within themselves, yet tragically unaware of the division. Horney identified 3 basic neurotic trends: moving toward people, moving against people, and moving away from people. Moving toward people. This type of person experienced feelings of isolation or fear in childhood, and as a result, attempted to win the affection of others in the family in order to feel safe. After several years of temper tantrums, they commonly became nice and docile. They found a strategy better suited to getting what they wanted. As adults, their need for affection and approval manifests itself as a deep need for a friend, lover, husband, or wife who will fulfill all expectations of life. The compulsive need to secure their chosen partner occurs irrespective of what that person feels about them. Other people seem like strange and threatening animals who must be won over. Through being submissive, caring, sensitive, and dependent, the other person may feel they are being killed by kindness. This type finds an effective way to create connections and therefore feel safe. The nature of the significant other does not actually interest them that much. Deep down, they may not even like other people. The main thing is to be accepted, loved, guided by, and taken care of. Ultimately, though, the need for belonging leads to misjudgments about other people. This type's taboo against being assertive or critical creates a poor little me feeling that progressively weakens them. Ironically, when they occasionally go out on a limb to be aggressive or detached, often they seem suddenly more likable. After all, their aggressive tendencies have not gone away. They have just been suppressed. Moving against people. In childhood, such people had a hostile family environment and chose to fight it through rebellion. They began to distrust the intentions and motivations of those around them. Adults of this type assume the world to be basically hostile, but may have acquired a veneer of suave politeness, fair-mindedness, and good fellowship. They are benevolent as long as others submit to their command. As fearful and anxious as the compliant type, instead of choosing belonging as their defense against a feeling of helplessness, they choose a path of every man for himself. They dislike weakness, particularly in themselves, and they are generally strivers for success, prestige, or recognition. Trust no one and never let down your guard might be their motto. Such extreme self-interest may involve exploitation or control over others. Moving away from people. Instead of wanting to belong or to fight, in childhood this type felt too close to those around them and tried to create distance between themselves and their family, retreating into a secret world of toys or books or wishes for the future. As adults, they have a neurotic need for detachment from the world that is quite distinct from a genuine wish for solitude, or a wish not to get emotionally involved with anyone, whether in love or conflict. This group may get on well with other people superficially, as long as their magic circle is not penetrated, and may live very simply so as not to have to work hard for others and lose control of their life. Able to live in splendid isolation because of a feeling of superiority over others and a belief in their uniqueness, they have a terror of being forced into joining a group, having to become gregarious, or engaging in common chit-chat at a party. Together with these features comes a craving for privacy and independence, and a hatred of anything that involves coercion or obligation, such as marriage or financial debt. Such people are happiest when they are fully loved by someone, yet they have few obligations to that person. Their detached nature involves numbness to what they really feel about something, often leading to terrible indecision. A healthy child or adult may express all of these tendencies above to some extent, harmoniously wanting to belong, fight, or be alone at appropriate times. It is when these are no longer choices but compulsions that the person becomes neurotic. This is the tragedy of neurosis, that it takes away free will, making people act out their tendency no matter how different the situation. Tendency to dependency. The intense work of repression, externalization of feelings, avoiding self-examination, and idealization of a certain self-image takes a huge amount of energy, so that the individual actually loses sight of himself. With this loss, other people paradoxically become more important and more powerful in the person's estimation. Their opinion gains a terrible power. In short, the extreme egocentrism of the neurotic person ironically leads to a loss of self and dependence on others. The competitive spirit of modern civilization, Horney wrote, was fertile ground for neuroses, because the emphasis on success and achievement gave people who had a weak self-image the opportunity to greatly compensate by becoming eminent. She noted, blind rebellion, blind craving to excel, and a blind need to keep away from others are all forms of dependence. Psychologically healthy people are not driven in any of these ways. Rather, their motivation is to express their talents more fully, make a solid contribution to an area of work that deeply interests them, or to love more deeply. They are inspired by the possibility of integration, not fired by desperation. Final comments. Horney's idea of the wholehearted person who is fully in touch with their genuine or real self is not that different to Abraham Maslow's self-actualized individual, or Carl Rogers' notion of becoming a person. To sum up her philosophy, Horney quotes psychologist John McMurray. What other significance can our existence have than to be ourselves fully and completely? She believed that we are all powerful people. Our neurotic tendency is simply a mask we put on in order not to show our real self. But in nearly all cases it is no longer necessary. We can reclaim a compliant, aggressive, or detached self, giving up the compulsive behavior that we believed would protect us from imagined harm. While she traced the origins of our inner conflicts to childhood, at the same time, Horney made people accept the present dimensions of their neurotic tendency or complex, so that they could not hide behind an attitude of, "This is how I am because of what happened to me." By confronting such truths, she brought many readers to the root cause of their problems. Our Inner Conflicts is well written, easy to understand, and contains many insights into human nature. Horney's optimism about the possibility of change is also quietly inspirational. Karen Horney. Karen Danielson was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1885. Her father, Bernd, captained ships and was a strict Lutheran. Her parents divorced in 1904, and 2 years later the ambitious and intelligent Karen entered medical school at the University of Berlin. She soon married well-off Ph.D. Oskar Horney, with whom she had 3 children. From 1914 to 1918, she studied psychiatry and underwent psychoanalysis, including sessions with Carl Abraham. She began teaching at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute, of which she was a founding member, and was involved in all the major psychoanalysis congresses and debates. In 1923, her husband's business failed, and he became ill. In the same year, her beloved older brother died of an infection, events that plunged her into depression. In 1932, separated from her husband, Horney moved to the United States with her daughters, taking up a post at the Psychoanalytic Institute in Chicago. 2 years later, she settled in New York, working at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, and enjoying the company of other European intellectuals, including psychologist Erich Fromm, with whom she had an affair. Her book, New Ways in Psychoanalysis, 1939, which critiqued Freud, forced her resignation from the Institute, leading her to found her own American Institute for Psychoanalysis. Horney highlighted the social and cultural factors in psychology in her book, The Neurotic Personality of Our Time, 1937. Other books included Self-Analysis, 1942, and Neurosis and Human Growth, 1950. Until her death in 1952, Horney continued to teach and work as a therapist. Feminine Psychology, 1967, a posthumous collection of essays, brought renewed interest in her work. Chapter 29. William James. The following are quotes from his 1890 book, The Principles of Psychology. Consciousness, then, does not appear to itself chopped up in bits. Such words as chain or train do not describe it fitly as it presents itself in the first instance. It is nothing jointed. It flows. A river or a stream are the metaphors by which it is most naturally described. In talking of it hereafter, let us call it a stream of thought, of consciousness, or of subjective life. The only thing which psychology has a right to postulate at the outset is the fact of thinking itself. The most peculiar social self which one is apt to have is in the mind of the person one is in love with. The good or bad fortunes of this self cause the most intense elation and dejection. To his own consciousness he is not, so long as this particular social self fails to get recognition, and when it is recognized, his contentment passes all bounds. In a nutshell, psychology is the science of mental life, which means the science of the self. William James is widely regarded as America's greatest philosopher. He is also, with Wilhelm Wundt, considered to be a father of modern psychology. Psychology was once an area of study within philosophy, and James was, for a number of years, a philosophy professor. The distinction he made between the two fields was this: psychology was the science of mental life, that is, of minds within a particular body, which exist in time and space, having thoughts and feelings in relation to the physical world they are in. On the other hand, explanations of thoughts as the product of some deeper force, such as the soul or ego, were really the realm of metaphysics or philosophy. James considered this new subject a natural science that required analysis of feelings, desires, cognitions, reasoning, and decisions according to their own features and dynamics, in the same way that one would explain building a house by looking at its stones and bricks. His choice to look at the phenomena of psychology, rather than some theory behind them, advanced the subject considerably, and achieved his aim of putting it on a firmer scientific footing. James was often depressed or in frail physical health, and the Principles of Psychology took him all of 12 years to write. In his preface he commented, "It has grown to a length which no one can regret more than the writer himself. The man must indeed be sanguine who, in this crowded age, can hope to have many readers for 1,400 continuous pages from his pen." This was the famous 2-volume long course, the full version of the book. But James also produced a condensed form, known as the Jimmy, to college students, who are grateful not to have to tackle the real thing. Given its size, it would be presumptuous to sum up James's masterpiece. However, we look at a few ideas that hopefully give a flavor of its contents. Creatures of habit. When we look at creatures from an outward point of view, James noted, one of the first things that strike us is that they are bundles of habits. What are habits exactly? In his research into the physiology of the brain and nervous system, James concluded that they boil down to being discharges in the nerve centers, involving a pattern of reflex paths that are successively woken up. Once one of these paths is created, it becomes easier for the nerve current to pass along the same path again. However, James noted a difference between the habitual behavior of animals and that of humans. While the actions of most animals are automatic and relatively limited and simple, because of our wide variety of desires and wants, humans have to consciously form new habits if we are to achieve certain results. The problem is that creating new, good habits requires work and application. James wrote that the key to good habits is to act decisively on the resolutions you make. Actions create the motor effects in our nervous system that turn a wish into a habit. The brain has to grow to our wishes, and the path will not be made unless this repeated action takes place. The key, James commented, was to make the nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. As we become permanent drunkards by so many separate drinks, so we become saints in the moral and authorities and experts in the practical and scientific spheres by so many separate acts and hours of work. Though we don't think they matter that much at the time, our actions taken together account either for a powerful integrity or a damning failure. This all seems very familiar to us now, but much of the emphasis on forging positive habitual behavior in today's psychology and personal development writing can be traced back to James's thinking on the subject. Us and the rest. James's understanding of psychology revolved around the personal self, that is, general talk about thought and feeling as abstract concepts did not mean much next to the personal reality of I think and I feel. He wrote that each person is separated from every other by a wall, that is, the skull enclosing the brain, and ventured that the world is neatly divided into two halves, with ourselves taking up one whole half, and the rest of the world, with everyone in it, in the other. One great splitting of the whole universe into two halves is made by each of us, and for each of us, almost all of the interest attaches to one of the halves. When I say that we all call the two halves by the same names, and that those names are me and not me respectively, it will at once be seen what I mean. This is a simple insight that, like so many of James's comments, borders on folk wisdom. However, it recognizes that people become interested in psychology not because they want to study broad principles regarding thought and emotion, but because they want to know why they think and feel the way they do. A division of the world into me and the rest is a little confronting, especially for those who consider that they live for others. Yet it is the very physiology of human beings, with one brain inside one body, always looking out at the rest of the world, that makes it a fact. The stream of thought. Not only do we all see the world differently, but our own personal consciousness will not be the same from day to day, or even hour to hour. As James puts this, we feel things differently according as we are sleepy or awake, hungry or full, fresh or tired, differently at night than in the morning, differently in summer and in winter, and above all things differently in childhood, manhood, and old age. The difference of the sensibility is shown best by the difference of our emotion about things from one age to another. What was bright and exciting becomes weary, flat, and unprofitable. The bird's song is tedious, the breeze is mournful, the sky is sad. He observed that we can never have exactly the same thought more than once. We may be able to sustain an illusion of sameness, but the fact of a constantly changing world, and the need of our continually altering reactions to it, mean this is impossible. Often we are ourselves struck by the strange differences in our successive views of the same thing. We wonder how we ever could have opined as we did last month about a certain matter. We have outgrown the possibility of that state of mind, we know not how. From one year to another we see things in new lights. And it is just as well, for this constant change, this perpetual movement and then return to equilibrium, is what makes us human. James also famously observed that thought is continuous, like a stream. We use phrases like a train of thought, or a chain of thought, but the real nature of thought is flowing. He noted, "The transition between the thought of one object and the thought of another is no more a break in the thought than a joint in a bamboo is a break in the wood. It is a part of the consciousness as much as the joint is a part of the bamboo." Since James, the science of psychology has parsed every thought, feeling, and emotion into thousands of categories, which indeed is the work of a science. But psychology would do well to remember that this is not how it feels to be conscious. Consciousness is not at all like the processing of a computer. Rather, to be alive is to experience a constantly flowing river of ideas, thoughts, and feelings. The successful self. James admitted that he had sometimes fancied being a millionaire, an explorer, or a lady killer, but came back to the sad truth that he had to settle on one self. To be many things would be too contradictory. To be effective in life, we have to choose from many possible personages, and stake our salvation on that self. The downside is that if you stake yourself on being, for instance, a great oarsman or a great psychologist, to fail at this ambition is a grievous hit to our self-esteem. If there is little gap between our potentialities and our actualities, we regard ourselves well. James famously provided a formula for self-esteem. Self-esteem is equal to success divided by pretensions. He pointed to a lightness of the heart when we give up chasing certain potentialities or illusions that we will never achieve, such as being young, slim, musical, or a famous athlete. Each illusion, if discarded, is one less thing that will disappoint us, and one less thing that will hold us back from real success. Final comments. James's focus on the self does not seem remarkable now, as we live in such an individualistic age. But at the time he was writing, the social fabric was much thicker, and one's place in society was arguably of much greater import than what went on inside one's head. Yet when we consider the restrictions he placed on his own subject, James's thinking could not really have gone any other way. His definition of psychology as the science of mental life meant the life within individual brains, the thoughts and feelings of individual people, not the human mind in general. While the 20th century psychologists who came after him got caught up in rather mechanical models of the mind and behavior, James described human consciousness as like the aurora borealis, the luminous northern lights, whose whole internal equilibrium shifts with every pulse of change. Such a poetic gift for explanation did not endear James to the lab rat in mazes brand of modern psychology, but it was precisely his artistic sensitivity, deep philosophical knowledge, and even openness to mystical ideas that allowed him to push out the boundaries of his field. Others would follow to do the laborious job of turning psychology into a science, but it needed a philosopher of his caliber to first paint a picture of the landscape. Much has been made of James's elegant and lively prose, and it is this, plus a personal, familiar tone unusual for the times, that makes the principles of psychology readable today. James was often overshadowed by his novelist brother, but William James could easily have been a writer himself, rather than a psychologist. It has been said that Henry James was the psychologist who wrote novels, and William, the novelist, who wrote psychology. That said, The Principles of Psychology is no easy read, with the good parts lying amid many long passages that either are quite technical, involving the psychology of the brain and nervous system, or mull over difficult concepts. James himself suggested that readers skip around and read what interested them, rather than going through the whole work. For someone who helped establish a science, a typically humble suggestion. William James. Born in New York City in 1842, the oldest son of Henry and Mary James, William James enjoyed a comfortable and cosmopolitan upbringing in a family of 5 children. His well-off father was deeply interested in theology and mysticism, particularly the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg. In 1855, the family moved to Europe, where James attended schools in France, Germany, and Switzerland. He learnt several languages and visited many of Europe's museums. Returning to the United States in 1860, James spent a year and a half trying to become a painter under William Morris Hunt, but decided to enroll at Harvard University. He began studying chemistry, but later changed to medicine. In 1865, he was offered the chance to go on a scientific expedition with the well-known naturalist Louis Agassiz, but suffered an array of health problems, plus, away from his family for the first time, terrible homesickness and depression. In 1867, he went to Germany to study physiology under Hermann von Helmholtz, and was exposed to thinkers and ideas in the new field of psychology. 2 years later, James returned to Harvard, where, at 27, he finally received his medical degree. Over the next 3 years, he experienced an emotional breakdown and was unable to study or work properly. In 1872, at the age of 30, he began his first job teaching physiology at Harvard. In 1875, he started giving courses in psychology, and also established the first experimental psychology laboratory in America. In the year he began work on The Principles of Psychology, 1878, he also married Alice Howe Gibbons, a Boston schoolteacher. They had 5 children. On their visits to America, James met both Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Among his famous students were educationalist John Dewey and psychologist Edward Thorndike. Landmark writings include The Will to Believe, 1897, The Varieties of Religious Experience, 1902, and Pragmatism, 1907. James died in 1910 at his summer home in New Hampshire. Chapter 30. Carl Jung. The following are quotes from his 1968 book, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. With the archetype of the anima, we enter the realm of the gods. Everything the anima touches becomes numinous, unconditional, dangerous, taboo, magical. She is the serpent in the paradise of the harmless man with good resolutions and still better intentions. She affords the most convincing reason for not prying into the unconscious, an occupation that would break down our moral inhibitions and unleash forces that had better been left unconscious and undisturbed. Whether he understands them or not, man must remain conscious of the world of the archetypes, because in it he is still part of nature and is connected with his own roots. A view of the world, or a social order that cuts him off from the primordial images of life, not only is no culture at all, but, in increasing degree, is a prison or a stable. In a nutshell, our minds are connected to a deeper layer of consciousness that speaks in terms of imagery and myth. Books in a similar vein. Isabel Briggs Myers' Gifts Differing, Anna Freud's The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, and Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. Why did primitive humans go to such lengths to describe and interpret happenings in the natural world? For example, the rising and setting of the sun, the phases of the moon, the seasons. Carl Jung believed that the events of nature were not simply put into fairy tales and myths as a way of explaining them physically. Rather, the outer world was used to make sense of the inner. By his time, Jung noted, this rich well of symbols, art, religion, mythology, which for thousands of years helped people understand the mysteries of life, had been filled in and replaced by the science of psychology. What psychology lacked, ironically given its borrowing of the ancient Greek term, is the understanding of the psyche, or the self in its broadest terms. For Jung, the goal of life was the individuation of this self, a sort of uniting of a person's conscious and unconscious minds so that their original unique promise might be fulfilled. This larger conception of the self was also based on the idea that humans are expressions of a deeper layer of universal consciousness. To grasp the uniqueness of each person, paradoxically, we had to go beyond the personal self to understand the workings of this deeper, collective wisdom. The collective unconscious. Jung admitted that the idea of the collective unconscious belongs to the class of ideas that people at first find strange, but soon come to possess and use as familiar conceptions. He had to defend it against the charge of mysticism, and he also noted that the idea of the unconscious, on its own, was thought fanciful until Freud pointed to its existence, and it then became part of our understanding of why people think and act the way they do. Freud had assumed the unconscious to be a personal thing contained within an individual. Jung, on the other hand, saw the personal unconscious mind as sitting atop the collective unconscious, the inherited part of the human psyche that was not developed from personal experience. The collective unconscious was expressed through archetypes, universal thought forms or mental images that influenced an individual's feelings and actions. The experience of archetypes often paid little heed to tradition or cultural rules, which suggests that they are innate projections. A newborn baby is not a blank slate, but comes wired, ready to perceive certain archetypal patterns and symbols. This is why children fantasize so much, Jung believed. They have not experienced enough of reality to cancel out their mind's enjoyment of archetypal imagery. Archetypes have been expressed as myths and fairy tales, and at a personal level, in dreams and visions. In mythology, they are called motifs. In anthropology, collective representations. German ethnologist Adolf Bastian referred to them as elementary or primordial thoughts that he saw expressed again and again in the cultures of tribal and folk peoples. But they are not simply of anthropological interest. Usually, without knowing it, archetypes shape the relationships that matter in our lives. Archetypes and complexes. Jung highlighted a number of archetypes, including the anima, the mother, the shadow, the child, the wise old man, the spirits of fairy tales, and the trickster figure found in myths and history. We'll look at two of these. The anima. Anima means soul with a female form. In mythology, it is expressed as a siren, a mermaid, a wood nymph, or any form that infatuates young men and sucks the life out of them. In ancient times, the anima was represented either as a goddess or a witch, that is, aspects of the female that were out of men's control. When a man projects the feminine aspect within his psyche onto an actual woman, that woman takes on magnified importance. The archetype makes itself present in a man's life either by infatuation, idealization, or fascination with women. The woman herself does not really justify these reactions, but acts as the target to which his anima is transferred. This is why the loss of a relationship can be so devastating to a man. It is the loss of a side of himself that he has kept external. Every time there is an extreme love or fantasy or entanglement, the anima is at work in both sexes. She does not care for an orderly life, but wants intensity of experience. Life, in whatever form. The anima, like all archetypes, may come upon us like fate. She can enter our life either as something wonderful or as something terrible. Either way, her aim is to wake us up. To recognize the anima means throwing away our rational ideas of how life should be lived, and instead admitting, as Jung puts it, that life is crazy and meaningful at once. The mother. The mother archetype takes the form of a personal mother, grandmother, stepmother, mother-in-law, nurse, or governess. It can be fulfilled in figurative mothers, such as Mary, Mother of God, Sophia, or the mother who becomes a maiden again in the myth of Demeter and Kori. Other mother symbols include the church, a country, the earth, the woods, the sea, a garden, a plowed field, a spring, or a well. The positive aspect of the archetype is motherly love and warmth, so celebrated in art and poetry, which gives us our first identity in the world. Yet it can have negative meaning. It can be the loving mother or the terrible mother or goddess of fate. Jung considered the mother the most important archetype because it seemed to contain everything else. When there is an imbalance of this archetype in someone, we see a mother complex. In men, the complex may give rise to Don Juanism, which can make a man fixated on pleasing all women. Yet a man with a mother complex may also have a revolutionary spirit, tough, persevering, extremely ambitious. In women, the complex can result in an exaggeration of the maternal instinct, with a woman living for her children, sacrificing her individuality. Her husband becomes just part of the furniture. Men may be initially attracted to women with a mother complex because they are the picture of femininity and innocence. Yet they are also screens onto which a man can project or externalize his anima, and he only later discovers the real woman he has married. In other forms of the archetype, a woman will go to any lengths so that she is not like her biological mother. She may carve out a sphere of her own, for example, becoming an intellectual to show up her mother's lack of education. A choice of marriage partner may be in order to antagonize and move away from the mother. Other women in the hold of the archetype may have an unconscious, incestuous relationship with their biological father and jealousy of their mother. They may become interested in married men or in having romantic adventures. Spiritual archetypes. Why is psychology as a science so young? Jung suggests that it is because, for most of human history, it simply wasn't necessary. The wonderful imagery and mythology of religions was able to express the eternal archetypes perfectly. People felt a need to dwell on ideas and images relating to rebirth and transformation. The religion supplied these in abundance for every aspect of the psyche. The Catholic Church's strange ideas of the virgin birth and the Trinity are not fanciful images, but packed with meaning, Jung wrote, archetypes of protection and healing that administered to any ruptures in the minds of the faithful. The Protestant Reformation reacted against all this. The rich Catholic imagery and dogma became nothing but superstition, and in Jung's view, this attitude made way for the barrenness of contemporary life. Genuine spirituality must engage both the unconscious and the conscious mind, he believed, the depths as well as the heights. All humans have a religious instinct, whether it is a belief in God or in some secular faith, like communism or atheism. No one can escape the prejudice of being human, Jung observed. Individuation. Individuation was Jung's term for the point at which someone is finally able to integrate the opposites within them, their conscious and unconscious minds. Individuation simply means becoming what you always were, in potentia, fulfilling your unique promise. The result is an individual in the real sense of the word, a whole and indestructible self that can no longer be hijacked by splintered aspects or complexes. But this reintegration does not happen by thinking about it rationally. It is a journey with unexpected twists and turns. Many myths show how we need to follow a path that transcends reason in order to fulfill ourselves in life. Jung went to some lengths to define the self. He understood it to be something different from the ego. In fact, the self incorporated the ego, just as a large circle encloses a smaller one. While the ego relates to the conscious mind, the self belongs to the personal and collective unconsciousness. The healing mandala. Jung included in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious many reproductions of mandalas, abstract patterned images whose name in Sanskrit means circle. He believed that when a person draws or paints a mandala, unconscious leanings or wants are exposed in its patterns, symbols, and shapes. In his therapeutic practice, Jung found mandalas to have a magical effect, reducing confusion in the psyche to order, and often affecting a person in ways that only became apparent later. They worked because the unconscious is allowed free rein. What has been swept under comes to the surface. Motifs such as egg shapes, a lotus flower, a star or sun, a snake, castles, cities, eyes, and so on, are produced for no obvious reason, yet reflect or draw out processes that are going on deep below that person's conscious thinking. When someone became able to make a meaningful interpretation of the images, Jung observed that it was usually the beginning of psychological healing. It was one step taken in the individuation process. Final comments. We think we are modern and civilized with all our technology and knowledge, but inside, Jung says, we are still primitives. In Switzerland, he once observed a local witch doctor remove a spell from a stable, in the shadow of a railway line on which several trans-European expresses roared by. Modernity does not do away with the need for us to attend to our unconscious minds. If we do neglect this side of ourselves, the archetypes simply look for new forms of expression, in the process derailing our carefully made plans. Usually the unconscious supports our conscious decisions, but when a gap appears, the archetypes are expressed in strange and powerful ways. We can be ambushed by lack of self-knowledge. The universe of ancient symbols we once used for deciphering life's changes and larger meaning has been replaced by a science, psychology, that was never designed to understand the soul and cater to it. About the scientific mindset in general, Jung wrote, "Heaven has become for us the cosmic space of the physicists, but the heart glows, and a secret unrest gnaws at the roots of our being. Modern man or woman lives with a spiritual emptiness that was once easily filled by religion or mythology. Only a new type of psychology that actually recognized the depth of the psyche would be able to quell this secret unrest." Carl Jung. Jung was born in Kessville, Switzerland in 1875, the son of a Protestant minister. In 1895 he enrolled at the University of Basel to study medicine, and when his father died the following year, had to borrow money to remain a student. He began to specialize in psychiatry, and from 1900 worked at Burghölzli Clinic in Zurich, under the pioneering psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler. In 1903 he married Emma Reuschenbach, a wealthy Swiss heiress, and they built a large house in Küsnacht for their young family. In 1905 Jung became a lecturer in psychiatry at the University of Zurich, and in subsequent years developed a successful private practice. In 1912 he broke with Freud, and 2 years later resigned from the International Psychoanalytical Society. Freud had considered Jung his heir in psychoanalytical theory, so the split was a major event. It enabled Jung to branch out and explore concepts such as synchronicity, individuation, and the theory of psychological types. Jung's other books include The Psychology of the Unconscious, 1911 to 1912, Symbols of Transformation, 1912, Psychological Types, 1921, Psychology and Religion, 1937, Psychology and Alchemy, 1944, and The Undiscovered Self, 1957. The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious is part 1 of the 9th volume of his collected works. After the Second World War, Jung was accused of having Nazi sympathies, but there was no conclusive evidence. He spent time with native peoples in America and Africa, and had a strong interest in ethnology and anthropology. Jung died in 1961 in Switzerland. Chapter 31. Alfred Kinsey. The following are quotes from his 1953 book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. One may become conscious of an increase in temperature in his own or the sexual partner's body surfaces, partly due to this peripheral circulation of blood, and perhaps in part due to the neuromuscular tensions which develop when there is any sexual response. Even very cold feet may become warm during sexual activity. The identification of sexual arousal as a fever, a glow, a fire, heat, or warmth testifies to the widespread understanding that there is this rise in surface temperatures. Among the married females in the sample, about a quarter, 26%, had had extramarital coitus by age 40. Between the ages of 26 and 50, something between 1 in 6 and 1 in 10 was having extramarital coitus. Since the cover-up on any socially disapproved sexual activity may be greater than the cover-up on more accepted activities, it is possible that the incidence and frequencies of extramarital coitus in the sample had been higher than our interviewing disclosed. In a nutshell, there is a gap between the variety and extent of our sexual lives and what society or religion permits. Books in a similar vein. Louann Brisendine's The Female Brain, Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, Harry Harlow's The Nature of Love, and Jean Piaget's The Language and Thought of the Child. The famous sex researcher Alfred Kinsey actually spent more than half his professional life as a zoologist, studying gall wasps. He was known on Indiana University's Bloomington campus as a rather haughty middle-aged professor who knew more about bugs than people. How then did he go from this to being held partly responsible for ushering in the sexual revolution? In the late 1930s, Indiana University's Association of Women Students made a petition for a course for married students or those contemplating marriage, and the job fell to Kinsey to run it. The students had questions such as, what would be the effect of premarital orgasm or sex on later married life? What is normal or abnormal in sexual activity? The little knowledge they did have had been shaped by religion, philosophy, or social mores, and Kinsey quickly found out there was more scientific information on the behavior of small insects than there was on the sexual behavior of human beings. The English physician, Henry Havelock Ellis, had produced the first dispassionate treatment of the subject, Studies in the Psychology of Sex, published in 7 volumes between 1897 and 1928. But it was banned by the British government. And of course, Freud had made sex less of a forbidden subject, but had never conducted large-scale scientific research. So in 1938, Kinsey began collecting his own data. 10 years later, Kinsey and his team published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, which, although written for a university audience, became a surprise national bestseller, selling over 500,000 copies. He became a national figure, and the Kinsey Institute for Sex Research became famous. That book was followed 5 years later by the 800-page Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, written with Paul Gebhard, Wardell Pomeroy, and Clyde Martin. The 2 volumes, probably because their titles were embarrassing to ask for in a bookshop or library, became known simply as the Kinsey Reports. In the year of the second book's release, 1953, Kinsey appeared on the cover of Time magazine.